There are moments when your mind seems to arrive before the world does. You think of someone just before they call. You feel uneasy before something changes. You know which way a conversation is going before the words are spoken. Most of the time, we dismiss these moments as coincidence, and perhaps many of them are. But the feeling itself is strange enough to ask why the mind is sometimes so good at sensing what has not happened yet. Science has names for some of this: prediction, pattern recognition, unconscious processing, and anticipation. But even those explanations leave behind a quiet mystery about how much your mind knows before you know that you know it. Tonight, we will explore that mystery carefully, from the subconscious brain to the strange nature of time, and ask whether sensing the future is less about magic and more about the hidden intelligence already moving inside you. If you have found your way here late at night or early in the quiet hours before the world wakes again, then welcome. This is the kind of place where questions are more important than answers, and where the strange experiences you carry with you are worth sitting with rather than setting aside. You do not need to believe anything in particular to be here. You only need to be curious. The Midnight Mind exists for exactly this kind of exploration. It is a space for people who want to think slowly, feel less alone in their inner experiences, and move through the edges of science and consciousness without being rushed toward a conclusion. If this kind of quiet, careful wondering is something that helps you rest, reflect, or feel more connected to the deeper strangeness of being alive, consider subscribing. There is always more to explore here, and it is always better explored together. While you are settling in, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of reality. There is something quietly beautiful about knowing that minds all across this planet are resting with the same question at the same hour, wherever their night happens to fall. For now, let yourself arrive fully. There is no rush here. The mystery we are about to enter is one that has followed human beings across every culture and every era of recorded thought, and it is not going anywhere. It will wait for you to get comfortable before it begins. Before we go further, it is worth being honest about what this exploration will and will not do. We are not going to tell you tonight that science has proven psychic powers are real. We are not going to claim that your premonitions are evidence of supernatural contact with the future. The science on those questions is genuinely unsettled, and pretending otherwise would not serve you or the mystery well. What we are going to do is something more interesting than that. We are going to follow the actual evidence about how the mind processes information, how it predicts, how it interprets time, and how it sometimes seems to know things that the conscious self has not yet been told. That evidence is already strange enough to deserve your full attention without being stretched beyond what it can honestly hold. The honest truth is that the boundary between unconscious pattern recognition and what some people have called intuition or premonition is not as clean as either believers or skeptics tend to suggest. There are real phenomena happening inside the brain that science is still working to understand. And there are also real biases, memory effects, and emotional processes that can make ordinary prediction feel like something more mysterious than it is. We will look at both sides carefully. So consider this a guided walk along a genuine edge of scientific knowledge, not the sensational edge where extraordinary claims go unquestioned, but the quieter and perhaps more interesting edge where the mechanisms of the mind itself remain partially unknown. and where some of the most careful researchers in neuroscience, psychology, and consciousness studies are still asking questions that do not yet have settled answers. You've probably had a moment like this. You are going about an ordinary day, and then something shifts inside you before anything outside you has changed. A low, quiet signal that something is different. Not a thought exactly, more like a pressure or a leaning or a sudden attentiveness in a direction you cannot name. And then, sometimes seconds later and sometimes longer, the thing you could not have known arrives anyway. It might happen with a person. You think of someone you have not thought about in months, and within minutes your phone lights up with their name. You have no logical reason for having thought of them, nothing in your immediate environment connected to them. And yet, there they were in your mind, just before they reappeared in your world. Or it happens with danger. You are walking somewhere familiar and something tells you to slow down, to cross the street, to take a different path. You cannot explain it in the moment, but you listen, and later you find yourself wondering what might have happened if you had not. The near miss you will never be able to measure because the direction you chose kept it from becoming a story with a harder ending. Sometimes it is quieter than that. A conversation begins and you already know where it is going, not because you have had this exact conversation before, but because something in the rhythm of it, something in the posture of the other person, something beneath the surface of the words, is already telling you. You wait for the sentence that confirms what you already felt, and when it comes, there is that strange doubling. The surprise that was not entirely a surprise. There are people who have woken from sleep with a certainty they could not explain, a feeling that something had shifted in the world while they were not watching it. A loved one, a change, a loss. And sometimes they are right. Not always, not even often, by the strict accounting of statistics, but often enough that the experience stays with them, often enough that they still remember it decades later. Others feel it with decisions, not the careful, deliberative decisions that unfold across hours of thought, but the sudden ones. The fork in the road that announces itself not through reasoning, but through something that feels almost physical. A pull toward one direction, a resistance around the other. And sometimes, looking back, the pull was pointing toward something that the conscious mind had not yet assembled into an argument. There are also the quieter versions that do not feel dramatic at all. The sense that today will be different before anything confirms it. The feeling of walking into a room and knowing the mood inside it before a single word is spoken. The awareness, on a perfectly ordinary afternoon, that something is quietly wrong, followed hours later by the news that confirms the feeling, was not simply anxiety. These experiences are not rare. Survey after survey across different countries and different cultures finds that the majority of people report having had at least one experience in their life that felt like knowing something before it was knowable. That does not prove the experiences are what they seem, but it does suggest that whatever is happening in those moments, it is happening to a great many human minds, and it deserves a patient and honest examination. One of the most telling things about these moments is how personal they feel. When they happen, they do not feel like a random thought that happened to land near a random event. They feel specific, directed, pointed toward something real. That specificity is part of what makes them so difficult to simply file away under coincidence and forget. There is also the emotional quality. These moments tend to carry a particular feeling that is different from ordinary imagination or wishful thinking, something that lands closer to recognition than to hope. a sense of being shown something rather than inventing it. Most people who have experienced it will tell you that it did not feel like a guess. It felt like a knowing, even if they could not explain where the knowing came from. And then there is the way memory holds them. Ordinary days blur together over years. The details of most conversations, most commutes, most afternoons dissolve into a general impression of having lived through time. But the moment of strange knowing tends to stay sharp. The exact feeling of it, the moment before the confirmation arrived, the way certainty settled into you without permission or reason. Memory treats these moments as significant, which suggests that somewhere in the architecture of the mind, they are being marked as something worth keeping. Many people who have these experiences feel slightly alone with them. They are not the kind of thing that comes up easily in conversation. There is a fear of sounding irrational or of being dismissed as someone who simply got lucky and then built a story around the luck. So the experience gets carried quietly, tucked into the private interior, occasionally brought out in low-lit conversations with people who seem safe enough to hear it. What is worth noticing is that these experiences do not tend to belong to a particular personality type or a particular kind of believer. Skeptics have them. Scientists have them. People who hold no belief in anything supernatural still report that strange pause before the phone rang, that quiet alarm before the bad news arrived. The experience itself seems to precede the explanation, regardless of the framework the mind eventually uses to contain it. There is something almost universal in the structure of these moments, even when the content differs wildly between people. The feeling of knowing before knowing, the awareness before the event, the quiet arrival of the mind at a place the world had not yet reached. Whatever its source, that structure is one of the oldest recurring experiences in human consciousness, and it is still happening to people tonight, all over this planet, in quiet rooms just like the one you are sitting in now. Here is the assumption most of us carry without ever examining it, that thinking is what the mind does, and that the mind only knows what thinking has produced. That consciousness is the manager of all inner processes, reviewing information, drawing conclusions, and making decisions with full knowledge of the workings beneath it. That what you are not consciously aware of is, for practical purposes, not happening. That assumption is wrong, and the evidence against it is not subtle or speculative. It is among the most well-established findings in modern cognitive science. The conscious mind is, in a very real sense, a late arrival to most of the decisions, perceptions, and conclusions that the brain has already been quietly reaching for milliseconds, seconds, and sometimes much longer before awareness shows up to take credit. Research into what is often called unconscious cognition has shown across decades in many different kinds of experiments that the brain processes enormous amounts of information below the threshold of awareness. Sensory data, social signals, bodily states, environmental patterns, emotional cues, all of it flowing through systems that do not require conscious attention and do not wait for conscious permission before beginning to draw conclusions. Think about what this means for a moment. Every experience you have ever had, every pattern you have ever witnessed, every emotional outcome you have ever lived through is somewhere in the structure of your nervous system, being referenced and cross-matched and updated continuously, entirely without your conscious knowledge. The mind you are aware of is reading a summary. The actual processing is happening in rooms you do not have access to. So when a feeling arrives that seems to know something you have not consciously been told, it may not be arriving from nowhere. It may be arriving from the vast underground of computation that your brain never stops performing. The part of you that has been watching, comparing, modeling, and predicting the world without ever sending you a memo about any of it, until it sends you a feeling. This is not a small or trivial point. It means that the ordinary assumption about where knowledge comes from, that it comes from what we've consciously observed and deliberately reasoned about, is only part of the story. A significant part of what you know has been assembled without your participation and delivered to you as an intuition, a hunch, a sudden certainty, or a quiet unease that arrives ahead of the evidence that would explain it. The most grounded and widely accepted explanation for the experience of sensing what is coming is the brain's extraordinary capacity for prediction. This is not a fringe idea. Predictive processing has become one of the central frameworks in contemporary neuroscience, and it suggests something radical about the nature of perception itself. That the brain does not simply receive information from the world and then react to it. Instead, the brain is constantly generating predictions about what is about to happen, sending those predictions outward to meet incoming sensory data, and only updating when reality does not match the model. In this view, perception is less like a camera and more like a conversation. The brain proposes a version of the world based on everything it already knows, and then the senses either confirm or correct that proposal. Most of the time, the proposal is so accurate that the correction is minor, almost unnoticeable. The world appears seamless and present because the mind has already, in a very real sense, arrived there a fraction of a moment before the sensory data confirmed it. This predictive architecture has deep evolutionary roots. An organism that can only react to what has already happened is at a significant disadvantage compared to one that can anticipate what is about to happen. The ability to model the near future, to run a rapid internal simulation of the most likely next state of the environment, is a survival mechanism of enormous importance. Your nervous system is, at its core, a prediction engine. It has been built and refined across millions of years to be very good at this. Subconscious pattern recognition is a related and equally important mechanism. The brain detects statistical regularities in the environment across time, often without any conscious awareness that this learning is occurring. You know, for example, that a particular tone of voice tends to precede a particular kind of conversation. You know that a certain quality of stillness before a storm is different from ordinary afternoon quiet. You have internalized thousands of these correlations without ever deliberately studying them, and they inform your expectations continuously. The body is involved in this process in ways that are still being mapped. Research on what is sometimes called somatic markers has suggested that the body produces physiological responses to anticipated emotional outcomes before conscious deliberation has completed. Changes in heart rate, skin conductance, muscle tension, and breathing patterns may occur in response to anticipated situations before the conscious mind has formed a clear thought about them. The body may be participating in prediction in ways that register as a gut feeling or an intuition before any reasoning has been completed. Emotional forecasting is another dimension of this. Human beings are not only predicting events in the world, they are constantly predicting how they will feel about possible futures. This emotional modeling draws on memory, expectation, fear, desire, and past experience simultaneously, and it operates largely below the threshold of awareness. A sudden wave of unease may be the result of an emotional forecast that your subconscious has already run, based on patterns you have not consciously recognized or named. Memory plays a role that is often underestimated. The experience of knowing something before it is confirmed can sometimes be traced to a genuine memory that was processed without conscious registration. A detail noticed peripherally, a conversation half heard, a tone of voice that carried information you did not consciously decode in the moment, but that was stored and later retrieved as a felt certainty. Memory is not a recording. It is a construction, and the materials used in that construction include a great deal of data that never passed through the spotlight of attention. There is also the role of expertise and embodied knowledge. In domains where a person has spent thousands of hours developing skill, the predictive capacity of the brain becomes dramatically more refined. An experienced clinician may feel that something is wrong with a patient before test results confirm it. A seasoned pilot may sense that something is off before the instruments show a change. This is not mysterious in principle. It is the result of a vast store of pattern recognition operating at speeds and levels of detail that conscious analysis cannot match. Attention itself is selective and unconscious in ways that most people do not appreciate. Your sensory system is detecting far more than your conscious mind is processing at any given moment. Stimuli that fall below the threshold of awareness can still influence cognitive and emotional states. A face glimpsed too briefly to consciously recognize may still produce an emotional response. A word heard too softly to consciously register may still influence the direction of thought. The boundary between knowing and not knowing is much more permeable than the ordinary experience of a clear and confident awareness would suggest. Taken together, these mechanisms form a picture of a mind that is doing an enormous amount of very sophisticated work beneath the surface of awareness. A mind that is modeling, predicting, pattern matching, emotionally forecasting, and drawing conclusions continuously and largely silently. And a mind that sometimes delivers the results of all of that hidden work as a feeling rather than an argument. That is a remarkable thing, and it goes a long way toward explaining why the experience of sensing what is coming feels so real, so specific, and so charged with a quality that seems to exceed ordinary guessing. And yet, after all of that careful, grounded explanation, something remains. There are moments that do not settle comfortably inside the story of subconscious pattern recognition alone. Moments where the precision of the intuition, its timing, its emotional specificity, or the complete absence of any detectable prior information makes the standard account feel like it is reaching past what it can honestly hold. Consider the moments that occur across genuine informational distance. The mother who wakes at the exact hour her child, living in another city, is involved in an accident. The person who reaches for the phone a full minute before it rings, not for a contact they expected to hear from, but for someone they had not thought of in months. These stories are easy to dismiss individually, and many of them deserve scrutiny. But they are told with a consistency of structure and emotional detail that makes the uniform application of coincidence feel like its own kind of intellectual laziness. The timing problem is one of the harder elements to explain away. Subconscious pattern recognition is powerful, but it operates on available information. It can detect signals in the environment that conscious attention has missed. It can integrate weak cues across time in ways that feel like sudden insight. But for some reported experiences, there is genuinely no traceable informational path, no prior contact, no ambient signal, no detectable pattern that could have been quietly processed. The timing is not just precise. It appears, in certain well-documented cases, to be impossible by the standard model. There is also the quality of the experience itself that gives some researchers pause. Most subconscious prediction arrives as a vague unease, a general sense of something being off, a soft signal rather than a specific and directed certainty. But some reported intuitions have a specificity that feels categorically different, not just a sense that something will happen, but a clear image, a named person, a particular location, a specific kind of event. Whether that specificity is generated after the fact by a memory that has been retroactively sharpened is a fair and important question. But the experience, as reported, does not always feel like a vague feeling that was later reinterpreted. It sometimes feels like a signal that arrived already focused. The cross-cultural consistency of these reports adds another layer of quiet difficulty. Every human culture across recorded history has recognized and named the experience of knowing before knowing. The specific frameworks used to explain it vary enormously, from ancestral communication to divine warning to the sensitivity of particular individuals. But the raw phenomenological experience, the structure of the moment itself, appears to be universal. That does not prove the experience is what it seems. But universal human experiences rarely point to nothing at all. There are also cases that involve the body in ways that pattern recognition alone does not neatly account for. Physiological responses, sometimes measurable, that appear to precede not just an emotional outcome but an apparently random event. Some researchers have investigated what they call presentiment, the idea that the body may show measurable signs of response to a stimulus before that stimulus is presented, in ways that go beyond simple anticipation of a known sequence. The results of such research are genuinely disputed. The methodology has been questioned. The effect sizes are small and the replications are inconsistent. But the fact that serious researchers have considered the question at all suggests that the conventional explanation is not fully closing the door. None of this is evidence that psychic powers are real, that the mind can access the future in a literal sense, or that the supernatural is operating beneath the surface of ordinary experience. That would be a leap far beyond what any of this careful noticing supports. But it does suggest that the classical explanation, while powerful and important, does not exhaust the question. There may be mechanisms at work that science has not yet fully characterized, operating at levels of the mind and the body that current models do not fully reach. The most intellectually honest position, the one that serves both the listener and the mystery, is to hold both of these things at once. The classical explanation is real and important, and explains a great deal, and something, perhaps a small something, perhaps a significant one, still remains outside it. It is in that remainder that the more interesting questions begin to live. The experience of knowing before knowing is not fully captured by the phrase subconscious pattern recognition, even though subconscious pattern recognition is genuinely happening. It is not fully captured by coincidence, even though coincidence is genuinely frequent. It is not fully captured by emotional forecasting, even though emotional forecasting is genuinely powerful. Whatever it is pointing at something real about the relationship between the mind and time. And that relationship, it turns out, is considerably stranger than ordinary waking life suggests. What we have done so far is to look at the experience from the ground level, from the inside of a quiet moment that felt like something it should not have been able to be. And then we looked at the scaffolding that science has built to explain it. Strong scaffolding, genuinely impressive, but with gaps at certain specific points where the structure does not quite reach the ceiling it was built to touch. Those gaps are where the next part of the exploration begins. Because to understand why the mind might sometimes seem to sense what is coming, we need to ask a deeper question first. A question about something so fundamental to ordinary experience that most of us never think to question it at all. We need to ask what time actually is and whether the brain truly experiences it the way we assume. Here is a question that sounds simple until you sit with it. Does your brain experience time in the same clean, sequential way that a clock measures it? Does the mind move through moments one after another in a strict and unbroken line from past to present, with the future entirely sealed and inaccessible until it arrives? The ordinary answer would be yes. Of course, that is what time is. That is how all of us move through reality. But neuroscience has been quietly complicating that picture for decades. The brain's relationship with time is not as straightforward as lived experience suggests. The mind does not simply register the present moment and file the past. It constantly constructs, revises, and sometimes reorders its experience of temporal sequence in ways that reveal the present as something far less fixed than it appears. One of the clearest examples of this is sensory timing. Different sensory signals, sight, sound, touch, travel through the nervous system at different speeds and arrive at the brain's processing centers at genuinely different moments. Yet, conscious experience almost always presents these signals as simultaneous. The brain is performing a temporal correction behind the scenes, holding some signals briefly in order to synchronize them with slower arriving ones, so that your experience of the world feels coherent and unified. You are not experiencing the raw present. You are experiencing a construction that the brain has assembled and aligned after the fact. The brain is also continuously revising its representation of recent events as new information arrives. What you experienced as the cause of a sensation can sometimes be updated retroactively by information that arrived afterward. There are experiments in perception where the brain reassigns the timing of events in ways that should be impossible if experience were a simple mirror of reality. The perceived moment of a touch can be shifted by what comes after it. The brain is not just experiencing time, it is editing it. This is not a small technical detail about neuroscience. It is a profound statement about the nature of conscious experience. The present moment, as you experience it, is not a direct readout of the physical now. It is a model. A slightly delayed, smoothed, corrected, and sometimes retroactively revised construction that the brain has assembled from fragments of incoming information and existing expectation. The feeling of being in the present is real, but the present you inhabit is, in a very precise technical sense, already slightly in the past. What this means for the question of sensing the future begins to become interesting. If the brain's relationship with time is not the clean, sequential, unidirectional flow that everyday experience implies, then the question of where prediction ends and something more unusual begins becomes much harder to answer with confidence. The mind is already performing extraordinary acts of temporal construction at every moment. It is already editing, delaying, revising, and modeling time in ways that conscious experience does not reveal. When the mind seems to arrive before the world does, perhaps it is not violating the rules of time. Perhaps it is simply doing what it always does, modeling what comes next with extraordinary sophistication, but doing it in a moment where the gap between the subconscious conclusion and the conscious confirmation is just wide enough to feel like something stranger than prediction. The machinery is not mysterious. The results in certain moments still are. This question, the question of how the mind relates to time and what that relationship might allow, is where the next layer of the exploration opens. And it opens not into speculation alone, but into actual research, actual debates among working scientists, and actual findings that have not yet been neatly resolved. That territory, the genuine edge of scientific understanding, is where we are going next. What you will find there is not proof of the supernatural, but it is not simply a restatement of the obvious either. It is something in between, which is perhaps the most interesting place a scientific mystery can ever be. The scientific study of intuition, prediction, and what some researchers have cautiously called anomalous anticipation has a history that is longer, stranger, and more complicated than most people outside the field are aware of. It is a history that includes serious researchers at serious institutions, along with a great deal of contested methodology, disputed findings, and genuine uncertainty about how to interpret results that do not fit neatly into existing frameworks. The most mainstream and well-established part of this research concerns the brain's predictive capabilities under ordinary conditions. Work in cognitive neuroscience over the past several decades has consistently shown that the brain is not a passive receiver of information. It is an active predictor. It is constantly generating models of what is about to happen and updating those models against incoming data. This finding, which emerged from many different research traditions, has become foundational in modern neuroscience. The work of researchers studying what is called the default mode network has added an important dimension to this picture. This network, a set of brain regions that become active when the mind is not focused on an immediate external task, appears to be heavily involved in mental time travel. The capacity to remember the past and to imagine or simulate the future. The brain appears to have dedicated infrastructure for moving through time in a non-literal sense, and this infrastructure is active and working even when the mind seems to be at rest. Research into expert intuition has also contributed significantly to this picture. Studies of chess grandmasters, experienced emergency physicians, firefighters, and military personnel have all found evidence that highly skilled individuals can make accurate assessments and decisions in fractions of seconds based on inputs they cannot consciously identify or articulate. The expertise has been internalized into the body and the nervous system in ways that bypass deliberate reasoning. The felt sense of what is right in these contexts is often more accurate than the laboriously constructed conscious argument. Moving toward the more controversial end of the research spectrum, the work of researchers studying what they have called presentiment has attracted both serious attention and sharp criticism. Some of these researchers have reported finding small but statistically measurable physiological responses in subjects shortly before they are shown emotionally arousing images, responses that appear to precede the presentation of the stimulus rather than follow it. Skin conductance changes, heart rate shifts, and other measurable signals that in a standard paradigm would be classified as anticipatory responses, but which appear to occur before the subject could have known what was coming. The controversy around this kind of research is substantial. Critics have pointed to methodological concerns including small sample sizes, Issues with how randomization was implemented, researcher expectation effects, and the difficulty of replicating results consistently across independent laboratories. These are serious concerns, and they deserve to be taken seriously. The field of precognition research has not achieved the kind of robust, independently replicated, methodologically airtight results that would compel mainstream scientific acceptance. At the same time, the dismissal of this research is sometimes performed with a speed and certainty that itself reflects something other than pure scientific reasoning. Some of the researchers involved have been careful, experienced scientists who have taken methodological criticism seriously and attempted to address it in subsequent work. The question of whether there is a small but genuine signal in some of this data, or whether the entire body of findings can be attributed to methodological artifacts, remains genuinely open in ways that the public discussion rarely acknowledges. Sleep research has contributed another interesting dimension to this conversation. During the phase of sleep associated with rapid eye movement, the brain is extraordinarily active. The prefrontal cortex, which handles deliberate reasoning and executive function, is relatively quiet. But regions associated with memory consolidation, emotional processing, and associative pattern recognition are highly engaged. Sleep may be a period during which the brain is integrating pattern information in ways that produce intuitive insights accessible after waking. Insights that feel like they arrived from nowhere because the processing that generated them was invisible. The neuroscience of body signals has added yet another layer. The enteric nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, contains hundreds of millions of neurons embedded in the gastrointestinal system and communicates bidirectionally with the brain in the head. The physiological states associated with anticipation, with unease before a difficult situation, with the felt sense of something being right or wrong, involve the body as an integrated whole in ways that purely brain-centered models of cognition do not fully capture. The gut feeling may not be a metaphor at all. It may be a description of a real information processing pathway. Research into the timing of conscious awareness has revealed a counterintuitive finding that remains one of the most discussed results in all of neuroscience. Work in this area has suggested that the brain initiates the neural activity associated with voluntary movements before the subject is consciously aware of the intention to move. The gap between the neural preparation and the felt moment of deciding is small but measurable. The interpretation of this finding is fiercely debated, and the original experiments have been refined and challenged in many ways. But the core observation points towards something important. The timing relationship between brain activity and conscious experience is not the simple sequence that ordinary experience implies. All of this research, taken together, creates a portrait of a mind whose relationship with time, with information, and with the threshold between knowing and not knowing is considerably more complex than the folk psychological picture of a conscious, deliberate, linearly operating self would suggest. None of it proves that the future can be literally sensed before it arrives. But it does suggest that the machinery available for prediction and anticipation is richer, deeper, more embodied, and more temporally complex than ordinary experience reveals. That machinery is the real subject of what we are exploring here. What the research is converging toward, even from many different directions and with many different levels of methodological confidence, is a picture of a mind that operates far more in the anticipatory mode than in the reactive one, a mind that is always already reaching forward. always already modeling what comes next, and sometimes, in particular moments, apparently reaching forward in ways that the current models of neuroscience and psychology cannot fully explain. What we still do not know, and what makes this territory genuinely alive as a scientific question, is where the boundary of ordinary prediction lies and whether anything real exists beyond it. That question deserves the careful attention of the next part of this exploration, where we will try to understand, in as simple and honest terms as possible, what the mechanism might actually look like from the inside. Let us set aside the technical language for a moment and try to build a simple picture of what might actually be happening when your mind seems to arrive before the world does. Not in the abstract language of neuroscience, but in terms that match the texture of actual human experience. Imagine that beneath the surface of your awareness, there is a system running continuously that is watching everything, not in a dramatic or sinister way, simply watching, noticing, registering. Every time you walk into a room and something feels subtly off, every time a conversation begins with a tone that carries information below its words, every time a person you know shows you something in their posture or their silence that their speech has not yet confirmed, that system is collecting all of it, all of the time, with far more precision than conscious attention ever achieves. Now imagine that this system is not just collecting, it is also comparing. Every new piece of information it takes in is being matched against an enormous library of previous experiences. Not memories you can deliberately recall, but patterns your nervous system has stored over a lifetime of living in the world. Patterns about how situations evolve, about how people behave when they are about to change, about how environments feel just before something shifts. This comparison happens automatically, continuously, and with extraordinary speed. At some point in this process, the system reaches a conclusion, not in words, not in a conscious thought, but in a felt state. A change in the body's baseline, a shift in attention, a quiet movement in the emotional field that says, without saying anything, that something is coming. This felt state rises toward the surface of awareness as a gut feeling, a premonition, a sudden sense of knowing. The conclusion has been reached. The reasoning that led to it stays invisible. And here is the part that makes the experience feel so strange. By the time you are consciously aware of the feeling, the processing that created it is already over. You've been given a result without access to the working. You experience the certainty without having witnessed the reasoning. So it does not feel like a prediction based on evidence. It feels like a direct knowing. It feels as though the future itself has sent you a message, because the internal experience of receiving an unexplained conclusion is indistinguishable from the internal experience of receiving information from outside the self. This is the core of what many researchers believe is happening in most, if not all, experiences of sensing the future. The mind is predicting. But it is predicting at a level and with a speed and completeness that conscious awareness cannot track. The gap between the subconscious conclusion and the conscious confirmation is the experience. The gap is the premonition. But now consider how this gap might vary. In most moments, the gap is essentially zero. The subconscious completes its modeling, and consciousness almost immediately receives the output as a thought, an observation, a perception. The processing is invisible, but the delivery is fast. In other moments, something happens that widens the gap. The subconscious reaches its conclusion significantly earlier, but the conditions for bringing it to awareness are not yet in place. The conclusion waits. It is held in a kind of sub-threshold state, present but not yet delivered. And then, when the right moment comes, it surfaces as a sudden certainty that seems to come from nowhere. What might cause that gap to widen? One possibility is that the intuitive signal is competing with louder, more insistent streams of conscious thought and only surfaces when those streams quiet. This is why many people report their clearest intuitions arriving in states of rest, in the moments between sleep and waking, in the middle of the night when the busy mental noise has settled. The conclusion was there. It was simply waiting for the quiet to carry it forward. Another possibility is that the pattern the subconscious has detected is a very weak one, a signal buried in noise. The system has noticed something, but it has not yet accumulated enough confirming data to cross the threshold into conscious awareness. It hovers below. You feel vaguely uneasy, vaguely attentive, without knowing why. And then something happens in the world that provides the final piece of confirming information, and the whole accumulated weight of quiet sensing suddenly arrives in awareness all at once, as a feeling of having known all along. Consider also the role of the body in carrying this pre-conscious information across time. Physiological states can persist, an elevated baseline of quiet alertness, a subtle shift in the pattern of breathing, a low-level activation of the systems associated with emotional response. The body may be holding the subconscious conclusion in a distributed form, while the conscious mind remains unaware. The felt sense of something coming may be, in part, the body's way of narrating a process that the brain has already completed, but not yet delivered to awareness. And then there are the cases where none of this quite explains the timing or the specificity, where the conclusion seems to have arrived before any detectable informational input was available. These are the cases that most interest the researchers at the edges of the field, the ones who are asking whether the predictive machinery of the mind is operating under constraints that current science has not yet fully mapped. Whether time as the brain relates to it may allow for forms of processing that the linear, sequential model of causality would not predict. This is not a claim that the mind can access the literal future. It is a more careful observation that if the brain's relationship with time is as complex and nonlinear as some evidence suggests, then the boundaries of what might count as ordinary prediction are harder to draw than they first appear. The mechanism we can describe with confidence is already extraordinary. The outer edges of that mechanism remain genuinely unknown. What you are left with, at the end of this mechanical picture, is something that may feel slightly less magical than the experience itself, but is perhaps more interesting. A mind of staggering hidden complexity, continuously modeling reality, continuously reaching forward into the near future, and sometimes delivering its conclusions in ways that make the ordinary feel, for a moment, like the extraordinary. It is worth being very clear about what the evidence actually supports and where it runs out, because this is a topic where the temptation to overclaim runs in both directions. Some people want very much for the science to confirm that the mind can literally sense the future across informational barriers, and they tend to read the evidence generously. Others want very much to establish that all such experiences have mundane explanations, and they tend to read the evidence with a skepticism that can become its own kind of confirmation bias. What the evidence supports, with high confidence and strong methodological backing, is that the mind is a prediction machine of extraordinary sophistication. The research on predictive processing, on unconscious pattern recognition, on somatic markers, on expert intuition, and on the body's role in anticipatory responses is substantial, replicated across many different research groups and experimental paradigms, and genuinely not in serious dispute. These mechanisms are real, they are powerful, and they can produce experiences that feel from the inside like knowing something before it is knowable. What the evidence supports with lower confidence and significant methodological disputes is the possibility that some anticipatory physiological responses may occur in ways that standard predictive processing does not fully explain. Some researchers have reported findings in this area. Those findings have not been consistently replicated. They have been challenged on methodological grounds. They remain interesting but not established. Anyone who tells you this research has definitively proven something has gone further than the data. What the evidence does not support at any currently defensible level of scientific confidence is the claim that human beings can literally access information about future events through a direct perceptual channel. No rigorous, well-controlled, independently replicated study has established that kind of capacity. The studies that have claimed to find evidence for it have consistently faced problems of replication, methodology, or statistical interpretation that prevent them from being treated as established findings. The honest position is this: the machinery of unconscious prediction explains most of what most people experience as intuition, premonition, or sensing the future. It explains it not as a trick or an illusion, but as a genuine and remarkable cognitive capacity. And at the very outer edge of that machinery, there is a zone of genuine scientific uncertainty where the current models do not yet fully close the question. That zone is small. It may shrink further as methods improve, or it may reveal something genuinely unexpected. No one knows yet. What is certain is that the experience you have had, the feeling of knowing before knowing, is not a sign of irrationality or wishful thinking. It is a sign that your brain is doing something real, something sophisticated, and something that science is still working to fully understand. That is worth holding on to, regardless of where the outer edge of the explanation ultimately falls. Here is the quiet revelation that all of this exploration has been building toward. And it is not about psychic powers or supernatural access to the future. It is something stranger and more intimate than that. Intuition is the moment when the subconscious mind has already finished its work, when it has already compared, modeled, pattern-matched, and reached a conclusion, and the conscious mind is finally receiving the delivery. That pause you feel, that sense of knowing without knowing why, is not a gap in understanding. It is the gap between two different speeds of intelligence operating inside the same skull. Your brain contains intelligences that do not speak in words. They do not send you reports or memos or carefully constructed arguments. They send you feelings. They change your baseline state. They shift your attention without telling you why. They alter the chemistry of your body before your thoughts have caught up. And sometimes, when the conclusion they have reached is significant enough, they send a signal so strong that it surfaces into awareness as a certainty, arriving ahead of any explanation that would satisfy the conscious mind's demand for evidence. This means that when you feel something before you can explain it, you are not imagining things. You are not being irrational. You are receiving a transmission from a part of yourself that has been watching the world with far more attention than you were consciously paying. That part has noticed something. It has run the calculation, it has arrived at an answer, and it is offering that answer to you in the only language it has, which is not words but feeling. The strange intimacy of this is worth sitting with for a moment. There is a version of you that is always several steps ahead of the version of you that is doing the talking and the planning and the conscious deciding. A version that has been quietly processing everything, integrating everything, drawing conclusions from patterns so subtle that they would be invisible if you tried to examine them directly. That version is not separate from you. It is the larger part of you, the part that has been here longer, watching more carefully, knowing more than it can say. When the sensation of sensing the future arrives, it is a rare moment of contact between these two versions, the quiet intelligence below sending its finding upward, the conscious self receiving something that feels like a message from outside, but is actually a message from within. The future was not telling you something. The hidden part of you was. The mystery does not disappear when you understand it this way. It deepens. Because the question now is not simply how the mind predicts, it is how vast and how deep the hidden prediction system truly is, and whether it might be operating through dimensions of time and information that science has not yet fully characterized. That question is where the speculation begins, and speculation, entered carefully and honestly, is where the most interesting territory of all opens up. Everything explored so far has stayed close to the established ground of neuroscience and cognitive science. But there is a wider territory, one that deserves to be entered carefully, with clear awareness that we are moving from the well-mapped into the genuinely uncertain. This territory asks whether the relationship between consciousness and time is stranger and more open than the mainstream model currently assumes. Physics itself has something quietly unsettling to say about time. At the level of everyday experience, time feels obviously directional. The past is fixed. The present is where we stand. The future is sealed. But in the mathematical structures that physicists use to describe reality at its most fundamental level, time does not obviously work this way. The equations of fundamental physics are largely time-symmetric. They describe processes that work equally well running forward or backward. The directionality of time, the arrow that makes the past feel different from the future, is something that emerges at the level of thermodynamics and large-scale physical processes, not something that is written into the deepest laws themselves. What this means philosophically is still debated. Physicists do not agree on what the time symmetry of the fundamental equations implies about the actual nature of time. Some interpret it as a sign that the distinction between past and future is less absolute at the most fundamental level than it appears. Others argue that it tells us nothing about the macroscopic world where human consciousness operates. The debate is genuine, and the conclusion is not settled. There are also interpretations of quantum mechanics that raise interesting questions about the relationship between observation, measurement, and the temporal unfolding of physical states. Some theoretical frameworks have proposed that quantum systems exist in superpositions of possible states until a measurement is made, and that the question of when exactly a particular outcome becomes definite is philosophically tricky. Whether any of this has implications for the experience of consciousness and time is a matter of genuine scientific uncertainty, and anyone who tells you the answer with confidence in either direction is going beyond what the current evidence supports. Some researchers working at the intersection of consciousness studies and physics have proposed that consciousness itself might have a non-trivial relationship with the physics of time. These proposals range from the relatively conservative, suggesting that consciousness might exploit quantum processes in the brain in ways that give it unusual temporal properties, to the highly speculative, suggesting that awareness might in some sense be non-local in time in ways that current science cannot fully account for. The conservative end of this spectrum is genuinely disputed. The highly speculative end is regarded with appropriate skepticism by the majority of researchers in the field. What is worth holding on to from this territory without overclaiming it is the following. The nature of time is not as fully understood as everyday experience suggests. The relationship between consciousness and time is not as fully understood as the folk psychological model implies, and the mechanisms by which the brain processes information across temporal scales remain an active area of research with genuinely open questions. That is not a claim that premonitions are proof of nonlinear time perception. It is a more careful observation that the ground beneath ordinary assumptions about time and mind is less solid than it looks. Imagine, just for a moment, a mind whose relationship with time is slightly different from the strict sequential model. Not dramatically different, not a mind that can read tomorrow's newspaper, but a mind whose predictive architecture is so refined and whose temporal processing is so rich and complex that the edge between the anticipated future and the sensed present becomes, in particular moments, genuinely blurry. A mind that is not so much predicting the next moment as it is processing a temporal region that includes the immediate next moment as part of its operating field. This is a speculative idea. It is worth holding clearly as a possibility rather than a conclusion. But it is a possibility that is consistent with both the phenomenology of strong intuitive experiences and with the genuine uncertainty about the nature of consciousness and time. It is a way of taking the experience seriously without abandoning the discipline of careful thought. What makes this model interesting is that it does not require any violation of physics as currently understood. It does not require a new force or a new particle or a new dimension. It requires only that the brain's temporal processing capabilities are more sophisticated than current models fully capture, and that consciousness, which remains deeply mysterious in its own right, may have a relationship with the physical substrate of time that is not yet fully described. That is a narrow opening, but it is a real one. It also changes how the moments of sensing might be understood, not as supernatural intrusions from a future that has somehow reached back to touch the present, but as expressions of a temporal intelligence already operating inside the brain. An intelligence that does not draw the boundary between now and next, quite where conscious experience draws it. An intelligence that is already, in some sense, there. If this picture, or even a cautious version of it, is in any degree accurate, it changes the way you might relate to the quieter signals that your mind sends you. Not as noise to be dismissed, not as magical prophecy to be trusted blindly, but as genuine data from a system whose capabilities are not fully visible to the conscious self. The practical implication begins with attention. If your subconscious mind is continuously processing information at a depth and speed that conscious awareness cannot track, then the signals it sends upward, the gut feelings, the quiet unease, the sudden attentiveness without a named reason, deserve a certain quality of regard, not uncritical acceptance, but not reflexive dismissal either. A kind of open, patient noticing that gives the signal room to clarify itself before it is either acted upon or discarded. Many traditions of wisdom from cultures across the world, and here we are talking not about supernatural belief systems, but about practical traditions of skilled attention, have emphasized the value of learning to distinguish the signal of genuine intuition from the noise of anxiety, wishful thinking, and emotional projection. This is a real skill. It is not mystical. It is a form of interior attention that can be developed through practice. The challenge is that both intuition and anxiety can feel urgent, and both can feel like certainty. Learning to tell them apart is a lifetime's work. There is something else worth considering in this picture. The hidden processing that generates intuitive feelings is drawing on everything you have experienced, everything your nervous system has registered, and everything your body has recorded about how the world works. This means that your intuitions are not random. They are, in a real sense, the distilled wisdom of your entire lived experience, expressed in a form that bypasses the limitations of slow, deliberate reasoning. The feeling that something is wrong or right or coming is not an accident. It is the product of an enormous amount of lived knowledge, compressed and delivered without explanation. This reframe changes the emotional relationship to these experiences. Rather than feeling haunted by them or anxious about their implications, it becomes possible to feel something more like awe. The quiet signal that arrives before you can explain it is not evidence that reality is threatening or unknowable. It is evidence that you carry an intelligence deeper and more capable than the one you can consciously access. That the self you know, the deliberate reasoning, planning self, is only the visible surface of a much larger awareness. There's also something quietly reassuring in this picture for the person who has sometimes felt that their inner experiences were too strange to admit to. The experience of knowing before knowing is not a symptom of irrationality. It is an expression of the brain doing exactly what it was built to do, only doing it in a way that exceeds the explanatory resources of ordinary conscious thought. You are not broken or strange for having these moments. You are experiencing the full depth of what a mind is. The relationship between intuition and trust is worth naming directly. Many people have had the experience of ignoring a strong intuitive signal and later wishing they had listened. Just as many, though these stories are told less often, have had the experience of acting on a strong intuitive signal that turned out to be wrong. The system is not infallible. It is powerful, but it is working from incomplete information, from patterns that may not apply to the current situation, from emotional residues of past experiences that can distort current assessment. Intuition deserves respect. It does not deserve absolute authority. What it deserves is the same thing that any intelligence deserves: careful engagement, the willingness to listen without immediately deciding, to hold the signal alongside conscious reasoning rather than in opposition to it, to treat the felt knowing as a contribution to the inquiry rather than a conclusion that closes it. This is not a way of diminishing intuition, it is a way of working with it more effectively. The deeper implication for the mind's relationship with the future is that you are always already in some form of anticipatory contact with what is coming. Not in a literal or supernatural sense, but in the sense that your brain is continuously modeling the near future with extraordinary sophistication, using every available input to generate the most accurate possible map of what the next moment will contain. You are never simply in the present, you are always partly in the anticipated next. The mind is always leaning forward, and sometimes, in particular moments, that lean forward produces a result so clear and so early that it crosses the threshold into felt certainty, a certainty that the world has not yet confirmed. That is not a violation of any natural order. It is a glimpse of the natural order at its most impressive. A brief moment when the gap between the mind's anticipatory intelligence and the world's actual unfolding becomes just narrow enough to feel from the inside like the future has already arrived. That feeling, when it comes, is worth receiving with curiosity rather than fear, with quiet wonder rather than the demand for immediate explanation. Because the intelligence that produced it has been at work your entire life, keeping you oriented, keeping you prepared, modeling the shape of what comes next with a faithfulness and a depth of attention that the conscious mind could never match. Tonight, that intelligence is still at work, even now, even in the quiet, especially in the quiet. It would be dishonest to move through this territory without giving the skeptical position its full weight, because it is a serious one, and it deserves serious engagement rather than a polite nod and a quick dismissal. The strongest argument against treating intuitive premonitions as a genuine form of knowing is the argument from memory bias. Human memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstruction, and that reconstruction is profoundly influenced by what happened afterward. When an event occurs that matches a prior feeling, the feeling is remembered with great clarity and confidence. When an event occurs that does not match a prior feeling, or when no event occurs at all, the feeling is typically not remembered or is reframed as something that was not really a premonition after all. This asymmetry in memory is powerful, and it can generate the impression of a far more reliable predictive capacity than the actual hit rate would support. Related to this is the phenomenon of confirmation bias. Once a person has had one experience that they interpret as a successful premonition, they become more attentive to subsequent experiences that fit the same pattern and less attentive to those that do not. The mind is very good at finding evidence for conclusions it has already reached. A person who believes they have intuitive abilities will notice confirmations and minimize disconfirmations in ways that feel entirely genuine from the inside, but represent a systematic distortion in how evidence is being processed. There is also the mathematical reality of coincidence. Given the sheer number of thoughts, feelings, vague unease states, and anticipatory sensations that pass through a human mind across a lifetime, some of them will align with subsequent events simply by chance. The alignment feels meaningful. The feeling itself is real. But the correlation between the feeling and the event does not require any explanation beyond the ordinary statistics of random co-occurrence. Most of what feels like sensing the future may simply be the small percentage of anticipatory feelings that happen to land near confirmatory events, weighted in memory by their emotional significance. These counter-arguments do not prove that intuition is meaningless or that all reported premonitions are memory artifacts and coincidence. They do prove that the reported experiences are very difficult to evaluate fairly from the inside, and that the most careful interpretation of them requires humility about the reliability of subjective certainty as evidence. Science has not proven that premonition is real. And the human mind's capacity for self-deception in this domain, while not a reason for cynicism, is a reason for careful and honest attention. And yet, the skeptical account, compelling and important as it is, does not leave the experience empty. Even if every reported premonition could be accounted for by memory bias, confirmation bias, and coincidence, which is a very large claim that cannot itself be established with certainty, the existence and persistence of these experiences would still be telling us something real and important about the mind. Consider what it means that human beings across every culture and every era of recorded history have had this experience, that it has left traces in the language of every civilization that has ever left written records, that it continues to be reported by people with no particular investment in the supernatural, by skeptics, by scientists, by those who know about confirmation bias and report it anyway. An experience this universal, this consistent in its structure, and this emotionally charged is not pointing at nothing. Even if its content is not what it seems, its existence is data. What it reveals, at minimum, is that the mind produces states of pre-conscious knowing that are genuine enough to be convincing. That the subconscious machinery of prediction is powerful enough to generate felt certainties that the conscious mind has not yet caught up with. That the gap between hidden processing and conscious awareness is wide enough and real enough to produce an experience that feels like contact with the future. And that feeling is not an error. It is a report from the real interior of a genuinely extraordinary cognitive system. The second revelation, then, is this. Even the skeptical explanation of these moments, when you look at it long enough, becomes a source of wonder, because it requires you to acknowledge how deep and how capable the hidden intelligence of the mind truly is. It requires you to recognize that you are carrying within you a system of such complexity and subtlety that it can reach conclusions faster than your awareness can follow, deliver them as feelings that feel like knowledge from outside yourself, and do this continuously, silently, for your entire life. If that is the mundane explanation, the mundane has become remarkable. And if, at the outer edges of that explanation, there is something that the current models do not yet fully describe, then the remarkable has become something worthy of the quietest and most careful awe. Let us return now to the moment where this began, the moment when your mind seemed to arrive before the world did, the phone not yet ringing, the news not yet delivered, the conversation not yet turned, and yet something in you already there, already oriented toward what was coming, already holding a knowledge it could not have been given through any channel you could identify. When that moment is looked at through everything that has been explored here, it changes, not diminishes, changes. It becomes, if anything, more interesting than the simpler supernatural interpretation, because it requires a more careful account of what you actually are. You are not simply a conscious self moving through a sequence of moments, reacting to events as they arrive. You are a vastly complex system of awareness, memory, pattern recognition, and anticipatory modeling, most of which is running continuously below the surface of anything you would call thought. The conscious self, the one that speaks and plans and deliberates, is receiving a highly curated summary of an enormous amount of hidden work. And sometimes, in particular moments, the gap in delivery time between the hidden conclusion and the conscious receipt becomes wide enough to experience. That experience, when it is understood this way, is not the mind reaching backward from a future that has already happened. It is the mind reaching forward with an intelligence so deep and so fast that the future it models often arrives before the conscious self has finished being surprised. The self that was surprised, the one that felt the sense of knowing before knowing, is the slower part. The knowing itself had already been accomplished by something deeper. This reframe has an emotional quality to it that is worth sitting with. There is something quietly protective in the idea that a deeper part of you has always been watching, has always been modeling the shape of what is coming, has always been oriented toward the threats and the changes and the arriving presences in your world, sending up signals in the form of feelings when its assessment becomes urgent enough to cross the threshold into awareness. You have never been as alone in your navigation of reality as the conscious experience of it sometimes suggests. The feeling of having known before knowing is, in this light, a brief moment when you caught a glimpse of that deeper navigation in progress. A window into the part of the self that runs beneath the self. The part that has been doing this work since before you had language, since before you had concepts, since before you had any framework at all for understanding what it was doing. That part is ancient, it is capable, and it is yours. What the experience is not, in this reframe, is meaningless. The dismissal of intuition as mere coincidence, as the work of a biased memory grafting significance onto random events, treats the experience as a failure of rationality. But the experience does not arise from a failure, it arises from a success. The subconscious system did something, it reached a conclusion. That conclusion was sometimes correct and sometimes wrong, but it was always real. It was always a genuine product of genuine processing. The only question was whether the conscious self was in a position to verify it. This is the reframe that this entire exploration has been moving toward. Not that the supernatural is real and science has been hiding it. Not that premonitions are proof of non-linear time perception, but that the experience itself, in all its strangeness and intimacy and emotional weight, is pointing at something genuinely important about what the mind is and how it operates. It is pointing at the depth and the sophistication of the hidden intelligence that runs beneath awareness. And that hidden intelligence, when caught in a moment of its own operation, produces exactly the feeling that has been reported by human beings across every culture and every century. The feeling of knowing before knowing. The feeling of the mind arriving before the world. The question of what lies at the outermost edge of that intelligence, whether it operates within the constraints of ordinary causality or whether it touches, in some still uncharacterized way, against the genuinely mysterious physics of time and consciousness, remains open. The honest answer is that we do not yet know, but the experience that asks the question is real. And the real experience of a deeply mysterious and genuinely extraordinary cognitive event is worth more than a hasty answer in either direction. There is a wider view available from here, if you are willing to look at it slowly. Not just the view of the individual mind and its hidden intelligence, but the view of what it means that consciousness, wherever it arises, is built this way. Every mind that has ever existed, across the entire span of human history and perhaps beyond, has been built around this same architecture of hidden prediction, temporal modeling, and felt anticipation. Every conscious being that has navigated the world has been doing so with this same strange gap between the hidden knowing and the conscious receiving. This is not a quirk of your individual neurology. It is a feature of consciousness itself as it has emerged in this universe, woven into the very structure of how awareness operates in time. That means something. It means that the feeling you have had, the feeling of seeming to sense what was coming, is not a private anomaly. It is a participation in something that belongs to the entire species, to the entire project of consciousness finding its way through reality. Every human being who has ever stood at the edge of a quiet moment and felt that strange forward lean of the mind, that sense of something arriving before it was announced, has been touching the same deep architecture, has been in contact with the same hidden intelligence, has been part of the same extraordinary mystery. There is a cosmological dimension to this that careful speculation can enter without dishonesty. The universe has been running for approximately 13.8 billion years. For most of that time, as far as we know, there was no awareness in it, no observer, no inner experience, no gap between known and unknown, because there was nothing to do the knowing. And then, through a process that science can describe in outline but whose deepest nature remains genuinely mysterious, matter organized itself in certain ways and gave rise to consciousness. And consciousness, whatever it is, brought with it the capacity to model time, to reach toward the future, to know before knowing. Whether that capacity is an accident, a statistical inevitability, or something that the universe was, in some sense, oriented toward, is a question that lies beyond what any current science can honestly answer. But the question itself has weight. The fact that a universe of matter somehow arranged itself to produce minds that lean forward into time, that anticipate and predict and feel the shape of what is coming, is a strange and beautiful fact about the nature of reality. And there is one more dimension of this that deserves to be named, even though it is speculative enough to require careful holding. If consciousness is genuinely mysterious in its relationship with the physical world, and it is, then the question of whether its relationship with time is as constrained as ordinary experience implies is genuinely open. Physicists who study the foundations of quantum mechanics and the philosophy of time do not agree about what time actually is at its deepest level. Philosophers of consciousness do not agree about what consciousness is or how it relates to the physical processes that appear to underlie it. In the space of those twin uncertainties, the possibility exists that something about the mind's relationship with the future is stranger than either the mechanistic mainstream or the credulous paranormal tradition has been willing to fully explore. Not proven, not established, but not foreclosed either. And in that possibility, there is room for exactly the kind of careful, grounded wonder that this channel has always tried to offer. The mystery is real, it is large, and it is not going away. What you are, sitting here in this quiet moment, is a temporary configuration of matter that has somehow become aware, that looks at itself and at the universe it finds itself inside and asks questions. That feels the pull of the future before the future has arrived. That carries a hidden intelligence of extraordinary depth and sophistication, running continuously beneath the surface of everything you consciously do. That is remarkable, not merely as a personal experience, but as a fact about what the universe does when given enough time and the right conditions. You are the universe sensing its own becoming, and sometimes, in the quietest moments, you feel that sensing before you know what it is pointing toward. If any part of this exploration has felt personally resonant, or if it has touched something you have carried quietly for a long time without knowing quite how to place it, it is worth allowing a moment of gentle integration, not analysis, not immediate conclusion, just the quiet allowing of what has been explored to settle. The experiences you have had, the moments of knowing before knowing, the felt certainties that arrived without explanation, are real experiences. They happened. Whatever their ultimate explanation, they arose from genuine processes in your genuine nervous system, and they were meaningful enough to remember. That meaning does not depend on whether they constitute proof of anything supernatural. They are meaningful because they are yours, because they belong to the interior of a consciousness that is genuinely extraordinary, regardless of how its stranger moments are ultimately explained. There is no need to decide tonight what the right framework for these experiences is. The honest answer is that multiple frameworks can hold partial truth simultaneously. The subconscious prediction account is real and important. The memory and coincidence account is real and important. The possibility that the mind's relationship with time is more complex than ordinary experience suggests is genuinely open. These do not cancel each other out. They describe different aspects of the same strange phenomenon, and the phenomenon is large enough to accommodate more than one kind of explanation. If the exploration here has left you feeling more curious than settled, that is probably the right response. The mystery we have been walking through is a genuine one. It is not fully solved. It may not be fully solvable with current tools. And there is something right about arriving at the edge of a genuine mystery and feeling its scale rather than reaching prematurely for a comfortable closure. What can be said, with confidence and without overstatement, is that your inner experiences are worth taking seriously, not credulously, not in ways that bypass the discipline of honest thinking, but seriously, with the respect that any genuine phenomenon deserves, regardless of how well it is currently understood. The feeling of knowing before knowing is telling you something about what you are, something worth listening to, even if the full meaning of it remains, for now, just beyond the edge of what can be clearly said. Be gentle with the strangeness you carry. It is part of being a mind in a universe that is stranger than it looks. Before this closes, there is a question worth leaving with you, not as a test or a challenge, but as an invitation to something that might be worth sharing. At some point in your life, you may have had a moment when you seemed to know something before it happened. A feeling, an image, a sudden certainty about a person or a situation or an event that arrived before the world had confirmed it. It may have been dramatic and specific. It may have been quiet and almost dismissible. It may have stayed with you for years, or it may have been something you had almost forgotten until tonight. If that experience is yours, consider sharing it in the comments below, not to prove anything and not to be judged, but because these experiences are rarely spoken aloud, and there is something quietly powerful about a space where they can be named and heard. You may find that others recognize the exact texture of what you are describing in ways that make the experience feel less solitary. This community is built around exactly this kind of honest, curious, careful sharing. The moments too strange for ordinary conversation, but too real to simply set aside. If you are here, you already understand why those moments matter, and so does everyone else in this quiet space. It is late, or perhaps it is the quiet edge of early morning. The room you are in has that particular quality of stillness that belongs to the hours when the world is mostly asleep and the mind is left to its own depth. This is the hour when the hidden intelligence runs closest to the surface, when the gap between what you know and what you are aware of knowing becomes, occasionally, narrow enough to feel. Think back to where this began, the moment before the phone rings, the feeling that something is about to change before anything has changed, the way certain conversations announce their ending before the ending is spoken. These experiences brought us into this exploration, and they are still the same experiences they were at the beginning, but perhaps they are sitting differently now. Perhaps they carry a slightly different weight. What they are pointing at is not a crack in the rational order of things. They are not evidence of chaos or of a universe that operates by different rules for different people. They are evidence of the depth of what a mind is, of how far beneath the surface of awareness the real work of consciousness goes, of how much of what you know has been assembled without your knowledge and delivered to you as a feeling rather than a thought. The mind that seems to sense what is coming is your mind. The intelligence that arrives before the explanation is your intelligence. The hidden system that watches and models and patterns and predicts continuously, silently, across your entire lifetime is not something separate from you. It is the larger version of you, the one that does not speak in words, the one that has been here longer than your conscious self, the one that will still be running its quiet calculations after this particular train of thought has ended and sleep has taken over. And somewhere in that larger version, something is always oriented toward what comes next, always leaning forward, always modeling the shape of the arriving moment before it arrives. You are never simply here. You are always, in some sense, already slightly ahead of here, already somewhere in the space between the present and the next thing. The mind at the threshold, watching, knowing, preparing, sending its quiet signals upward. Tonight, when you close your eyes and let the darkness arrive, notice what is still moving beneath the surface, the quiet hum of the machine that never stops, the part of you that is already modeling tomorrow while tonight is still here. The hidden intelligence that has walked beside you your entire life, knowing things it could not tell you until the right moment, until now, until the next moment, until the one after that. The mystery does not end when the video does. It continues in you, running in the background, doing its patient and extraordinary work. And the next time you feel that quiet certainty arrive before you have any reason for it, you will know a little more about what is happening. You will know that the larger part of you has been watching, that it has reached a conclusion, that it is sending you in the only language it has, its finding. Listen for it, not with urgency or demand, but with the quiet, open attention that mystery deserves. Because whatever that deeper intelligence knows, it knows it on your behalf. It always has. And in that knowledge, in that vast and patient and hidden knowing that underlies everything you are, there may be more wonder than any dream or vision or strange midnight certainty has ever been able to fully name.